6 weeks before our wedding, I discovered Tinder on my fiancé's phone. 3 days later, I learned something far worse than cheating, and it ended with his parents watching him lose everything. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 29 years old, and 6 weeks before I was supposed to marry the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, I learned something that changed the way I look at trust forever. At the time, I thought I'd caught my fiancé cheating. Looking back, I wish that had been all it was. What I found was a side of Ryan I didn't know existed. What I found wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a version of Ryan I had never seen before, a version that had apparently been hiding behind polite smiles, future plans, and an engagement ring. Ryan was 27, and by that point we'd already spent 4 years building a life together. We'd been engaged for 8 months. The wedding venue was booked, deposits were paid, and both families had already moved on to debating seating charts and guest lists. As far as everyone around us was concerned, our future was already underway. From the outside, everything looked solid. I thought it was solid too. That's probably why the changes caught me off guard. They didn't happen all at once. If Ryan had suddenly become cold overnight, I would have noticed immediately. Instead, it happened gradually enough that I kept explaining it away. It started with small things that were easy to ignore. Ryan seemed to be texting more often than usual, especially late at night. His phone was almost always face down, and whenever a notification appeared, his attention shifted to it immediately. If a message arrived while we were watching television, he'd glance at it almost instantly. Sometimes a message would make him smile. Other times, he'd quietly leave the room before replying. Whenever I asked who was texting him, the answer was always vague. Just friends. People from work. Nothing important. The explanation sounded reasonable. The defensiveness didn't. One night, I casually asked why one of his friends seemed to text him after midnight every night. Ryan didn't even look up from his phone. People stay up late. Every single night? That earned me a heavy sigh. Natalie, not everything is suspicious. I remember sitting there wondering how a simple question had somehow become an accusation. That started happening more often. The more distant Ryan became, the more defensive he got whenever I noticed. If I asked where he was going, I was controlling. If I asked why he seemed distracted, I was insecure. If I asked whether everything was okay between us, he acted like I was creating problems that didn't exist. Eventually, I started questioning myself. I kept searching for reasonable explanations. Maybe wedding stress was getting to both of us, or maybe I was simply overthinking things because the wedding was getting closer. That's the dangerous thing about being with someone who slowly convinces you that your instincts are wrong. You stop trusting yourself. I spent weeks doing exactly that. Meanwhile, Ryan seemed more interested in everything outside our relationship than anything happening inside it. What started as the occasional night out slowly became a routine. Before long, Ryan seemed to spend more evenings with his friends than with me. Some weeks he spent more evenings out than at home. The strange part wasn't that he went out. The strange part was how much effort he suddenly put into it. One Saturday morning, I found him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, trying on different shirts. We didn't have plans. It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a work event. He was supposedly meeting friends. Yet he'd already changed clothes twice. When I teased him about taking longer to get ready than I did, he snapped. Can you stop interrogating me? The word caught me off guard. Interrogating. I hadn't even asked a real question. I was joking. But something about his reaction stayed with me long after he left. Because happy people don't usually feel interrogated by harmless comments. That afternoon I called my mother. Not because I thought Ryan was cheating. Not yet. I just needed somebody objective. By the end of the conversation, my mother said something simple. If something feels off, don't ignore it. I wish I'd listened sooner. 2 weeks later, everything changed. Ryan and I were sitting on the couch after dinner. He got up to grab water from the kitchen and left his phone beside me. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't touching it. I wasn't trying to catch him. The screen lit up on its own, and there it was. Tinder. The icon sat right there on the home screen. Impossible to miss. For a second, I genuinely thought there had to be an explanation. Maybe it belonged to a friend. Maybe it was an old account. Maybe there was some innocent reason I couldn't immediately think of. When Ryan came back into the room, I pointed at the screen. Why do you have Tinder? The reaction told me more than the app ever could. A flash of panic crossed his face. It disappeared almost immediately, replaced by irritation. Why are you looking through my phone? I stared at him. I didn't. The icon is literally on your screen. My friend wanted help setting up his profile. Why would he need your phone for that? Instead of answering, he got angry. Within 5 minutes, we were somehow arguing about privacy. By 10 minutes, he was acting like I had violated his trust. By 15 minutes, I found myself apologizing just to end the conversation. After he went to sleep that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The argument kept replaying in my head. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. He never denied having Tinder. He never gave a believable explanation. He never reassured me. All he did was make me feel guilty for noticing. Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and opened my laptop. I didn't have a master plan. I wasn't trying to trap him. I simply wanted to know whether my instincts were lying to me, or whether I had been ignoring the obvious. The following evening, after work, I created a fake dating profile. I used photos from a woman who had moved overseas years ago. She was attractive, polished, and exactly the kind of person Ryan seemed fascinated by lately. I built the profile carefully. Successful career, frequent travel, luxury lifestyle, high income. The sort of image that practically screamed status. Over the previous year, Ryan had become obsessed with status. Not openly, not enough for people to notice immediately. But I'd heard the comments. His coworker's girlfriend got a luxury SUV. Someone else bought a condo downtown. Another couple spent 2 weeks in Italy. Every story somehow ended with Ryan comparing our life to somebody else's. The profile I created represented everything he seemed to think he was missing. Once it was finished, I adjusted the location settings and started swiping. I wasn't nervous at first. Part of me still expected nothing to happen. Maybe I'd discover I was overreacting. Maybe I'd delete the account and feel ridiculous for doubting him. Then Ryan's profile appeared. I stared at it longer than I expected. There was something surreal about seeing the face of the man you planned to marry sitting inside a dating app. The same smile, the same photos, the same person who had spent years talking about our future. My thumb hovered over the screen. I remember thinking how strange it was that everything we'd built together had somehow led to this moment. Then I swiped right. The waiting didn't last long. 1 minute passed. Then another. I tried distracting myself by checking emails. A few moments later, my phone buzzed. It's a match. My stomach dropped. I told myself it could still mean nothing. People swipe accidentally. People use old accounts. People forget to delete apps. I was halfway through that mental list when a new notification appeared. A message. Already. I opened it. The first sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because it was especially cruel. Because it arrived so quickly. Because it confirmed he was actively using the account. Because it erased every excuse I'd spent weeks making on his behalf. The message read, "Finally, a woman who actually looks like she has her life together." I stared at the screen. Ryan was sitting 10 feet away in our living room watching television, completely relaxed, completely unaware that he had just destroyed the last benefit of the doubt I was willing to give him. And as I read that message again, a terrible realization settled over me. The problem wasn't that Ryan had matched with someone. The problem was how eager he'd been to do it. And something told me that if I kept talking, I was about to find out exactly who my fiancé really was. I responded before I had time to talk myself out of it. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I enjoyed what I was doing. I needed certainty. After weeks of wondering whether I was imagining things, certainty suddenly felt more valuable than comfort. So I kept the conversation simple, friendly, casual, exactly the way two strangers might talk after matching online. Ryan responded almost immediately. That pattern continued for the next several days. Morning messages before work, texts during lunch, conversations late at night while he sat beside me on the couch pretending to watch television. A few times I actually heard his phone vibrate and knew exactly what message had just arrived because I was the one who had sent it. That was probably the strangest part of the entire experience. Watching someone lie to your face while unknowingly telling you the truth at the same time. The more we talked, the clearer his priorities became. He wasn't interested in who this woman was. He was interested in what she represented. The questions came one after another. What kind of car do you drive? Do you own your condo? How often do you travel? What do you do for work? Do you invest? What neighborhoods do you like? At first, I tried to convince myself I was reading too much into it. Maybe people ask those questions all the time. Maybe it wasn't about money. Maybe. Then he started bringing those topics up repeatedly. That ended the debate. Within a single evening, Ryan learned more about the fake profile's financial situation than he'd asked about my life in months. And that realization hurt more than finding Tinder. Because Tinder could have been explained away. Neglect couldn't. I started paying closer attention to things I'd been ignoring. The little comments he'd been making for almost a year. How his coworker's boyfriend bought her a Mercedes. How another couple took luxury vacations every few months. How someone his age had already purchased a second property. None of those comments had seemed significant at the time. Now they felt different. Now they sounded less like observations and more like comparisons, as though Ryan had been quietly measuring our life against everyone else's and finding it lacking. 3 days into our conversations, the topic shifted. I asked whether he was seeing anyone. The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. then disappeared, then returned. I remember staring at the screen while my heart pounded harder than it should have. When the message finally arrived, it was only 4 words. Technically, I'm engaged. Technically bothered me more than it should have. He wasn't describing our engagement like a man excited to get married. He was describing it like an obligation, as if our relationship was some inconvenient detail standing between him and something better. I forced myself to continue. That sounds complicated. The response came back within seconds. Honestly, it is. Another message followed. I don't even know if I should be getting married. That one sat on the screen for a long time. We'd spent years talking about marriage, buying a house, and building a future together. Yet somehow a complete stranger was hearing doubts he'd never once shared with me. If Ryan had genuinely been struggling, I would have listened. If he'd told me he was unhappy, I would have taken it seriously. But he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to a woman he thought had money. That distinction mattered. A lot. I asked why he felt that way. His answer arrived so quickly it felt rehearsed. She's a good person. The sentence almost made me laugh. I'd heard people use that exact phrase before saying something cruel. A few seconds later, Ryan proved me right. She's just boring. I stared at the message. Read it again. Then a third time. The woman who helped him through 3 job changes. The woman who stayed with him when money was tight. The woman who spent years building a future with him. Boring. The word felt absurd. Unfortunately, Ryan was only getting started. Message after message appeared. She never wants to do anything exciting. Everything is about budgets. Everything is about responsibility. Sometimes I feel like I'm dating somebody's mother. That one landed harder than the others. Not because it was clever. Because there was a small piece of truth buried inside it. I had become the responsible one. Someone had to be. Over the previous year, Ryan's spending habits had changed dramatically. More expensive clothes. More expensive restaurants. More expensive tastes in general. Whenever I suggested saving money, I became the practical one. The cautious one. The person ruining the fun. At some point, I had quietly accepted the role because I thought that's what partners do. You balance each other. Apparently, Ryan saw it differently. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. Part of me wanted to shut the laptop and confront him immediately. Walk into the living room. Show him the messages. End the conversation right there. But another part of me needed to know how far this went. Because if I stopped now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. So I kept going. Then why stay? That question took longer to answer. Long enough that I wondered whether he was finally thinking carefully. When the response arrived, it felt like a punch. The wedding is already planned. Another message followed. Our families are involved. Then another. If I met the right woman before then, I'd probably leave. I felt physically sick. Not because he wanted someone else. Because of how casually he said it. There was no sadness, no guilt, no struggle. He talked about ending our relationship the same way someone might discuss changing travel plans. As though 4 years together were simply an inconvenience. The conversation kept getting worse. Ryan started talking about ambition. About success. About the lifestyle he thought he deserved. Eventually, my name came up again. This time he wasn't even pretending to be fair. Natalie has no ambition. I actually laughed when I read that. A short, bitter laugh. I was managing projects worth millions of dollars. Working 50-hour weeks. Climbing steadily in my career. But apparently ambition only counted if it came packaged in luxury brands and expensive vacations. The most painful messages arrived later that evening. The fake profile mentioned being close with her parents. Ryan responded almost immediately. You should meet mine someday. A second message followed. They're normal. At first I didn't understand what he meant. Then another message appeared. And suddenly I did. Unlike my fiancé's family. I felt my stomach sink. Deep down, I already knew where this was going. I just wasn't prepared to see it written out. Ryan continued. Her mom is obsessed with coupons. Every meal turns into a budgeting exercise. It's honestly embarrassing sometimes. I sat frozen in front of the screen. I stared at the screen and suddenly wasn't thinking about Ryan anymore. I was thinking about my mother standing in grocery store aisles comparing prices. I was thinking about school shopping trips where she somehow made a limited budget feel like enough. I was thinking about birthdays that felt magical even when money was tight. Ryan saw coupons. I saw sacrifice. And Ryan was mocking her because she used coupons. Something changed inside me right then. Until that moment, I had still been looking for explanations. Still hoping there was some misunderstanding hiding underneath all of this. That hope disappeared. The sadness didn't vanish, but it hardened, turned into something clearer. Because insulting me was one thing. Insulting the people who loved and supported me my entire life was something else entirely. I stared at the screen while Ryan kept talking about wanting more from life. He kept talking about a bigger life, more money, more luxury, and experiences he believed he was missing out on. Eventually, one final message appeared, a message so honest that it accidentally revealed everything. I'm tired of pretending I don't want more. A few seconds later, he added, life's too short to settle. Settle. The word sat there like a challenge. 4 years together. An engagement. A wedding already being planned. And somehow I was the person he had settled for. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my laptop. I didn't call him out. Instead, I opened a folder and started saving screenshots. Every message, every insult, every complaint, every lie. The folder grew larger by the minute. By the time I finished organizing everything, a strange calm had settled over me. The relationship wasn't ending because of something I was about to do. The relationship had already ended. Ryan just didn't know it yet. And as I looked through the screenshots one final time, I realized exactly who needed to see them next. Not Ryan, his parents. The decision came surprisingly easy once I stopped thinking about what I wished were true and started looking at what was actually happening. For weeks, I'd been trapped in that uncomfortable space where your instincts are screaming one thing while your heart keeps arguing for another. For weeks, I'd been inventing explanations for his behavior, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable answer. The screenshots ended all of that. Looking at the screenshots made arguing with myself impossible. Everything was right there in black and white. Ryan had explained exactly who he was and exactly how he felt. He just hadn't realized he was talking to me when he did it. The following morning, I woke up feeling strangely calm. Not happy. Definitely not happy. But calm. The kind of calm that comes when a difficult decision has already been made. Ryan kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. That part almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because less than an hour later, he sent 3 messages to the fake profile asking how my morning was going. Watching someone play 2 different roles at the same time is unsettling. The loving fiancé. The eager single man. Both existed. The only difference was that one version thought nobody was watching. Over the next 2 days, I gathered everything. Every message, every screenshot, every insult, every comment about me, every comment about my family, every suggestion that he'd leave me if someone wealthier came along. By Thursday morning, I had enough evidence to remove any doubt from the situation. That afternoon, I called Ryan's father. Richard answered on the second ring. He'd always been good to me, the kind of man who didn't waste words. Retired military. Practical. Direct. The sort of person who believed actions mattered more than speeches. Natalie? Hi, Richard. The concern in his voice appeared almost immediately. Everything okay? I glanced at the folder sitting open on my laptop. No. A brief silence followed. What happened? I took a breath. I need you and Karen to meet me tonight. His tone changed instantly. Is Ryan okay? Physically, yes. The pause on the other end felt heavier this time. What does that mean? It means there's something both of you need to see. Another silence. Then he surprised me. If you're calling us instead of handling it privately, I'm guessing this isn't something small. It isn't. What time? 6:45. Where? I gave him the restaurant name. Ironically, it was the exact restaurant Ryan had agreed to visit with the woman he thought might replace me. An upscale Italian place he'd mentioned several times over the previous month. The same restaurant he'd complained was too expensive whenever I'd suggested trying it together. Apparently it wasn't too expensive anymore. Not when he thought somebody else was paying. Richard agreed to come. Karen did too. Neither asked many questions. Neither needed convincing. By late afternoon, my nerves finally showed up. Until then, I'd been operating on adrenaline. Collect evidence. Make calls. Set everything up. Keep moving. Now there was nothing left to do except wait. And waiting gave my brain time to imagine every possible outcome. Maybe Ryan would deny everything. Maybe he'd storm out. Maybe his parents wouldn't believe me. Maybe somehow this would become my fault. The thoughts kept circling until my phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. Working late tonight. I stared at it for several seconds before laughing quietly to myself. Technically, he wasn't lying. He wasn't coming home after work. He had plans, just not the plans he thought he had. I arrived at the restaurant around 6:30. The restaurant looked exactly like the kind of place Ryan had been obsessing over for months. Dark wood interiors, expensive wine displays, low lighting. Everything about it screamed success before you'd even opened the menu. The kind of restaurant where nobody glances at the menu prices. A year earlier, we would have saved it for an anniversary. Recently, Ryan had started talking about places like this as though they should be normal Tuesday night dinners. The hostess greeted me and confirmed the reservation. Table for 4, under the fake profile name. Perfect. Richard and Karen arrived a few minutes later. The moment I saw them walking toward me, I felt a sudden wave of guilt. Not because of what I was about to do, Because I genuinely liked them. They had treated me like family for years, and in less than 20 minutes, their view of their son was about to change forever. Karen sat down first. Natalie, you're making me nervous. Richard pulled out a chair. Let's see what you've got. I handed them my phone. Neither spoke while reading. At first, their expressions were simply confused. Then confused turned into concerned. Concern became disbelief. And eventually, disbelief gave way to something much harder to look at. Disappointment. Karen covered her mouth halfway through. Richard's face became completely unreadable. He scrolled slowly, methodically, reading every message, every complaint, every insult, every plan. When he reached the comments about my mother, he stopped. The muscles in his face tightened. He actually wrote this? I nodded. Karen shook her head immediately. No, he wouldn't. Without saying a word, I showed her the next screenshot. Then the next. Then another. The evidence did all the talking for me. By the time they finished reading, nobody needed an explanation. Ryan had already explained himself. The room felt different after that. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just heavy. Like everyone at the table suddenly understood something they wished they didn't. Richard carefully placed my phone down. When is he supposed to get here? 7. Karen looked toward the entrance. He thinks he's meeting another woman? Yes. The sadness on her face wasn't sympathy. She looked embarrassed for him, because she knew exactly what he was about to walk into. A few minutes later, the hostess looked toward the front door. I followed her gaze. Ryan had arrived. For a second, I barely recognized him. His hair was styled. He was wearing a fitted dark blue shirt I'd never seen before, the expensive watch he'd bought recently, the cologne he usually saved for special occasions. He looked like someone heading into a first date, not someone preparing to get married. Karen closed her eyes briefly. Richard didn't move at all. Ryan followed the hostess toward our table with a confident smile. The smile lasted until he saw me. His expression changed so fast it almost looked painful. Confusion. Recognition. Panic. His eyes immediately shifted to Karen. Then Richard. The color drained from his face. The hostess glanced between all of us, clearly sensing something was wrong. Sir? Ryan didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the table, trying to understand how his fantasy had somehow become a family intervention. I offered a small smile. The same smile I'd worn through birthday dinners, family holidays, and wedding planning meetings. The same smile he'd spent days calling boring behind my back. Hi, Ryan. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood there, frozen, like his brain had stopped working. And judging by the look on his face, he already knew exactly why he was there. Ryan eventually pulled out a chair and sat down, though it looked less like a choice and more like his legs had given up on him. A few seconds earlier, he'd walked into the restaurant expecting excitement, possibility, and validation. Now he was staring at his parents, his fiancé, and a table full of evidence. What is this? He finally asked. His voice sounded different, smaller, not because he didn't know the answer, because he did. People ask questions like that when they're desperately hoping reality is something other than what it appears to be. I folded my hands on the table. You tell me. His eyes immediately moved to his parents. Neither of them said a word. That silence seemed to bother him more than yelling would have. Ryan looked back at me. You set me up. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't denial. It wasn't even surprise. It was a defense. The first thing he wanted to discuss wasn't Tinder. It wasn't the messages. It wasn't the fact that he'd agreed to meet another woman while engaged. It was the fact that he'd been caught. I created a profile, I said. His shoulders relaxed slightly, as though he'd found something he could work with. I knew it. The relief in his voice was impossible to miss. For a split second, he genuinely looked hopeful. Like maybe this could somehow become my fault. You catfished me. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. You matched with the profile in less than 5 minutes. His expression tightened. That's not the point. No, Richard said quietly. It is exactly the point. Ryan turned toward his father. Dad, don't. The single word stopped him cold. Richard wasn't a loud man. He didn't need to be. When he spoke that way, people listened. Ryan shifted in his chair. This whole thing was manipulative. I reached for my phone. Interesting. I unlocked it and pulled up the screenshots. Would you like to explain these first? The moment he saw the messages, his confidence disappeared again. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't about Tinder. It wasn't about fake profiles. It was about his own words. Words he couldn't explain away. Words he couldn't blame on anyone else. Karen stared at him. Did you really write those things about Natalie? Ryan rubbed a hand across his face. Mom, it wasn't like that. What was it like? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because there wasn't a good answer. There rarely is when someone gets caught telling the truth by accident. Karen pointed toward the screen. You called her boring. Ryan looked away. You mocked her family. Still nothing. You told another woman you'd leave your fiancé if somebody better came along. The disappointment in her voice seemed to hit him harder than anything I'd said. Ryan finally spoke. I was just talking. The words hung there for a moment. Even he sounded unconvinced. Richard leaned back in his chair. Talking? Ryan immediately grabbed onto the explanation. People say things online they don't mean. Really? Richard asked. Then why were you here? That ended the argument before it started. Ryan stared at the table. No answer. No excuse. Nothing. Because there wasn't a version of reality where he could explain away showing up. Flirting could be denied. Messages could be minimized. Intentions could be debated. Actually arriving at the restaurant was much harder to explain. I watched him struggle with that realization. The same man who'd been so confident in his messages suddenly couldn't form a complete sentence. Finally, he looked at me. I wasn't actually going to cheat. There it was. The technical defense. The argument people make when the evidence is overwhelming, but they still need a way to feel innocent. I nodded slowly. Okay. Ryan blinked. The response clearly surprised him. Okay? Let's pretend that's true. His expression brightened slightly. Then I continued. You downloaded Tinder. The brightness disappeared. You matched with another woman. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. You flirted with her for days. Karen looked down. You trashed me. I could see Ryan wanting to interrupt. I didn't give him the chance. You insulted my mother. That one made him flinch. Good. Because out of everything I'd read, that was still the part I couldn't get past. Not because it hurt my feelings. Because it revealed his character. What bothered me wasn't the flirting. It was how casually he'd mocked people who had done nothing except care about him. Cruelty comes from somewhere deeper. I held his gaze. Then you agreed to meet her. Ryan looked away first. So tell me something. His eyes returned to mine. If I hadn't been sitting here tonight, what exactly would have happened next? The table went completely still. Not because anyone expected an answer. Because everyone already knew it. Ryan knew it too, which was why he couldn't respond. Karen slowly shook her head. I don't understand. The sadness in her voice felt genuine. You loved her. For the first time all evening, Ryan looked ashamed. Actually ashamed. Not angry. Not defensive. Ashamed. And seeing that expression was surprisingly painful, because it reminded me of the version of him I used to know. The version who brought me coffee when I worked late. The version who stayed awake with me after my father died. The version who made me believe we were building something real. Then he spoke, and whatever sympathy I felt disappeared. I've been unhappy. I stared at him. Being unhappy wasn't the issue. Relationships go through difficult periods all the time. What mattered was what he chose to do with that unhappiness. You never understood what I wanted. There it was. The blame. Not complete blame. Just enough blame to spread responsibility around. Enough to make himself feel better. I shook my head. Ryan, if you were unhappy, you could have talked to me. I tried. No, you didn't. His eyebrows rose. Yes, I did. You complained. I leaned forward slightly. Those aren't the same thing. Ryan didn't answer, because he knew I was right. Complaining isn't communication. Comparing your relationship to someone else's isn't communication. Making passive-aggressive comments about money isn't communication. Talking to another woman certainly isn't communication. I kept going. You never sat me down and told me you were having doubts. You never told me you were reconsidering the wedding. You never told me you were questioning our future. I paused. You told a stranger. That landed. I could see it. Because suddenly there was nowhere left for him to hide. Everything had been stripped away. The excuses, the justifications, the technicalities. All that remained was a very simple truth. He'd been willing to discuss our relationship with a stranger before discussing it with the woman he planned to marry. Karen wiped her eyes. Richard remained silent. Ryan looked exhausted. And somehow I knew the hardest part still hadn't happened. Because ending a relationship isn't usually the moment someone gets caught. It's the moment they finally realize they're about to lose it. And judging by the look on Ryan's face, that realization was beginning to arrive. I could almost see the moment reality caught up with him. His parents weren't defending him. I wasn't begging him to explain. And this wasn't an argument he could smooth over with the right words. Ryan leaned back in his chair and stared at the table. For the first time all evening, nobody was accusing him of anything. Nobody was talking. The screenshots had already done their job. The truth was sitting there between us. It didn't require additional evidence. Karen broke the silence first. Do you actually believe the things you said about Natalie? Ryan rubbed his forehead. What things? The question sounded weak even before it left his mouth. Karen's eyes filled with fresh disappointment. The comments about her being boring. She paused. The comments about her family. Another pause. The comments about leaving her if somebody better came along. Ryan's shoulders sank. He looked tired now. Not physically tired, emotionally exhausted. Like somebody who had spent so much energy avoiding accountability that he no longer had the strength to continue. No, Karen frowned. No what? No, I don't actually believe those things. Nobody responded immediately. Because the answer created a bigger question. If he didn't believe them, why say them? Ryan seemed to realize that too. Before anyone could ask, he added quietly, I was trying to impress her. The explanation landed with a dull thud. Not because it was shocking, because it was pathetic. Even Ryan seemed embarrassed hearing it out loud. I stared at him. You were trying to impress a stranger by insulting the people who cared about you. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, there was no anger left. Only regret. I know. Richard finally spoke. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment behind it was impossible to miss. No, son. Ryan looked up. I don't think you do. The table went quiet again. Richard folded his hands. I could understand if you were unhappy. Ryan looked surprised. I could understand if you were having doubts. Karen turned toward her husband. Even she seemed unsure where he was going. Richard continued. Relationships fail sometimes. He nodded toward me. That happens. Ryan looked relieved for a second. Then Richard kept talking. What I don't understand is how you convinced yourself she was the problem. The relief disappeared immediately. You spent days painting Natalie as some obstacle standing between you and the life you wanted. Richard's gaze hardened. That's the part I can't get past. Ryan looked away, because there wasn't a defense for that. None. Not a reasonable one. Richard gestured toward my phone. That woman stood beside you through every job change. Ryan remained silent. She helped you when money was tight. Nothing. She built a future with you. Still nothing. Then Richard delivered the sentence that seemed to hit hardest. And while she was planning your wedding, you were shopping for an upgrade. Ryan's face dropped. Karen started crying again. Not loudly, just quietly. The kind of crying that comes from disappointment rather than shock. The kind parents cry when they realize their child has become someone they don't recognize. Seeing that hurt more than I expected. Not because I felt bad for Ryan. Because I genuinely cared about his parents. They were good people. They didn't deserve this. Karen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm so sorry. I immediately shook my head. You don't owe me an apology. Maybe not. Her voice trembled. But I still feel like I do. Ryan stared at that interaction. His mother comforting me. Not him. And I think that was the moment reality fully arrived. The moment he understood that this wasn't just an embarrassing evening. This was the end. His eyes locked onto mine. Natalie, I already knew what was coming. We can fix this. The sentence sounded desperate. Not manipulative. Not angry. Desperate. Like somebody trying to stop water from pouring through a crack after the dam has already broken. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wished he'd said something different. Not because it would have changed anything. Because after 4 years together, I wanted at least one honest moment. One completely honest moment. Instead, Ryan kept talking. I screwed up. His voice cracked. I know I did. I listened. Things got in my head. He looked embarrassed. I started comparing us to other people. He laughed bitterly. Everybody online looks richer. Nobody interrupted him. Everybody at work seems more successful. He stared down at his hands. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I deserved something different. That was probably the most honest thing he'd said all night. Unfortunately, honesty arriving after betrayal doesn't erase betrayal. It only explains it. Ryan looked at me. I'm sorry. The words sounded genuine. The problem was that genuine regret and repaired trust are two different things. I believed he was sorry. I really did. But I also believed that if the profile had belonged to an actual wealthy woman, he would have walked into this restaurant anyway. Both things could be true. That was the tragedy. I took a slow breath. Then I reached for my engagement ring. The moment my fingers touched it, Ryan stopped talking. Karen noticed too. Richard lowered his eyes. Nobody needed an explanation. The gesture explained itself. For months, that ring had represented every plan we'd made together, from the home we hoped to buy to the life we thought we'd build side by side. Now it felt like a promise made to a version of Ryan that no longer existed. Slowly, I slid it off my finger. The diamond caught the light as I placed it on the table. The sound was barely audible, yet somehow it felt louder than every conversation we'd had that night. Ryan went pale. His eyes locked onto the ring. Then onto me. No. The word escaped him automatically. Like a reflex. Natalie. I shook my head. My voice remained calm. Not because I wasn't hurting, because I'd already done the grieving. The screenshots had taken care of that. The man I thought I was marrying had disappeared days ago. This dinner was simply where reality caught up. You ended this before tonight. Ryan stared at me. I continued quietly. The only difference is that tonight you finally had to see it happen. Karen wiped away tears. Richard looked away. Even he seemed affected by the finality of it. Ryan looked like somebody had knocked the air out of his lungs. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he finally whispered the thing he'd probably been wanting to say all evening. I love you. The words hung there, heavy, painful, late. I believed him. That was the worst part. I believed he loved me. I also believed he would have betrayed me. I believed he loved me. I also believed he would have betrayed me. Accepting both truths at the same time hurt more than I expected. I stood up, reached into my purse, placed money on the table for my portion of dinner. Then I turned toward Karen and Richard. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Karen stood and hugged me. A real hug. The kind that nearly breaks your composure. Richard rose from his chair a moment later. He shook my hand firmly. You deserve better than this. I nodded, because if I tried to speak, I probably would have cried. Then I turned toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Ryan saying my name. Once. Then again. I didn't stop walking. Because after everything I'd learned, there was only one thing left to do. Leave. And for the first time in weeks, I knew I wasn't making the wrong decision. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already vibrating. Ryan. Then Ryan again. Then Ryan again. The first call came before I even started the engine. The second arrived while I was pulling out of the parking lot. By the time I got home, I'd stopped counting. I wasn't avoiding him to punish him. I simply didn't know what conversation was left to have. The truth was already on the table. Literally. There wasn't some hidden piece of information that would suddenly make everything different. There wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. Ryan had told me exactly who he was. He just hadn't realized he was telling me. When I finally checked my phone later that night, there were dozens of messages. The first few sounded desperate. Please answer. Can we talk? Please don't do this. Then came the explanations. Then the apologies. Then the promises. And eventually, the messages started sounding frustrated. Like Ryan couldn't understand why saying sorry wasn't magically fixing everything. I turned my phone off and went to bed. For the first time in weeks, I slept all the way through the night. No overthinking. No wondering. No trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. The uncertainty was gone. Painful as the truth had been, certainty was easier to live with than doubt. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. I already knew who it was before I looked through the peephole. Ryan looked like someone who hadn't slept since the restaurant. His eyes were red, his shirt was wrinkled, and the confidence he usually carried around had completely disappeared. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway. He stared at me for a second. Natalie. His voice sounded exhausted. What do you want? I just want to talk. We already talked. Not really. I almost smiled. That was the problem. People always want one more conversation after they get caught. One more chance to explain. One more opportunity to reshape the story. One more attempt to make consequences disappear. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. I know how bad this looks. The sentence immediately annoyed me. Not because it was rude, because it focused on appearances, not actions. Looks. I folded my arms. That's your problem right there. His forehead creased. What? You're still talking about how it looks. He stared at me. I continued. You don't seem to understand why this happened. I do. No. My voice remained calm. You understand you got caught. That landed harder than I expected. Ryan looked away. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Eventually, he sighed. I was stupid. Yes. I got caught up in things. Yes. I compared us to other people. Yes. Every answer seemed to frustrate him more. Because I wasn't arguing. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't giving him anything to fight against. The fight was already over. Finally, he asked the question he'd been avoiding. So that's it? I nodded. That's it. The words seemed to physically hit him. No wedding. No second chance. No long reconciliation arc. Just an ending. Real life isn't always dramatic. Sometimes relationships die in a very quiet way. Sometimes one person simply reaches a point where they can't trust the other anymore. Ryan stood there for several seconds. Then he nodded. Slowly. Defeated. And walked away. I honestly believed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Ryan became obsessed with controlling the story. It started with social media. Nothing direct. Nothing that mentioned me by name. Just vague posts about manipulation. Trust. Betrayal. Toxic relationships. The kind of posts designed to make people ask questions. The kind that paints someone as a victim without actually saying what happened. Some people believed him. Some didn't. I ignored all of it. Then mutual friends started reaching out. A few of them sounded confused. Others sounded angry. Apparently, Ryan had developed a very different version of events. In his version, I had created a fake profile to trap him. In his version, I'd humiliated him. In his version, the restaurant confrontation was somehow worse than the behavior that caused it. I didn't waste energy defending myself. The screenshots existed. The truth existed. People who mattered eventually found both. The rest weren't my responsibility. What surprised me most wasn't Ryan. It was his parents. A week after the restaurant, Richard called. I expected an awkward conversation. Instead, he asked how I was doing. Actually doing. Not whether I was angry. Not whether I hated Ryan. Just whether I was okay. That simple question nearly broke me, because nobody had asked it yet. Everyone wanted details. Everyone wanted drama. Richard just wanted to know if I was all right. We ended up talking for almost an hour. Toward the end of the conversation, he said something that stayed with me. We probably protected him too much. I didn't know how to respond. Richard continued. Every time he made a bad decision, somebody softened the consequences. His voice sounded tired. Maybe that's why he thought he'd get away with this too. After we hung up, I sat with those words for a long time, because he might have been right. The more I thought about what Richard said, the more it made sense. Ryan had spent years being rescued from the consequences of his decisions. A month passed, then another. Life became quieter. The wedding plans disappeared. The future I'd imagined disappeared with them. But something unexpected happened too. The anxiety disappeared. The constant pressure of trying to be enough for someone else disappeared. The feeling that I was being compared to everyone around me disappeared. And little by little, I started feeling like myself again. About 3 months after the restaurant, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. I almost deleted it without reading. Almost. Then I opened it. It was Ryan. The message was short. No excuses. No blame. No attempts to restart the relationship. Just one sentence. I really am sorry. I stared at the screen for a while. Long enough to realize I wasn't angry anymore. Long enough to realize I wasn't sad either. Mostly I felt distant. Like I was reading a message from someone I used to know. In another life, that apology would have meant everything. 3 months earlier, I would have cried reading it. Now it felt different. Not because it wasn't sincere. Because sincerity had arrived too late. I didn't reply. Not out of spite. There simply wasn't anything left to say. The apology was sincere, but sincerity couldn't undo what had already happened or make me see him the way I once had. Some stories don't need a final conversation. Some endings don't require the last word. A few months later, my mother and I were having dinner together. Nothing special. Just an ordinary weeknight. We ended up at Olive Garden. Her choice. Halfway through the meal, she pulled a coupon out of her purse and slid it across the table with a grin. A year earlier, Ryan would have rolled his eyes. He would have made some joke about it later. My mother noticed me smiling. What? I shook my head. Nothing. My mother handed the coupon to the waiter and smiled like she'd just won something. I laughed. A year earlier, Ryan would have been embarrassed by that. Sitting across from her that night, I couldn't imagine why. The waiter brought back the discounted bill. My mother looked genuinely proud of the money she'd saved. I laughed. And somewhere in that completely ordinary moment, I realized I hadn't thought about Ryan once during the entire meal. That was when I knew he no longer mattered.